Hi there subscribers, and it's Geekonomics here once again. Today we are looking at extract 3 of the F585 pre-release stimulus material. So once again, this is applicable to those of you who are probably resitting the F585 paper, and this will be your last opportunity to resit this paper as it will become the legacy specification. So we're up to extract 3, ladies and gentlemen, if you've been following this playlist that I've been putting together. What I'd like to do today is to just talk to you about the very first paragraph. There's a lot in this extract, so I'm going to break it down paragraph by paragraph, talk you through it, talk about the relevant theory for each paragraph, and then at the end of this series I will then give you my predictions with regard to what the likely questions will be given the area of the specification which is being assessed by way of this particular extract. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to it. So I shall just read it and point out the key terms which I think are most important with regard to analysis of theory here, and then we'll have a little bit of a look at each in turn. So Brazil is South America's most populous country and the largest economy, with a GDP of 2.4 trillion in 2014. Since the turn of the millennium, there have been improvements in a number of, and here we go, ladies and gentlemen, directly pointing us into the correct area of the syllabus and specification, the number of development indicators. So here already it's setting the scene for what follows with regard to economic development. Reductions in poverty, an important term. A fall in the Gini Coefficient, another important term. Improvements in healthcare provision. And a rise in school attendance. So these are all improvements in Brazil's development indicators. However, such progress did not prevent the Brazilian government from facing serious criticism both over the need for structural reform and with regard to its current economic crisis, of which the extract goes into more detail in the very last paragraph of this particular extract. So I'll highlight that, but we'll say more about it when we get to that particular paragraph. So ladies and gentlemen, here are the areas of theory which I think that you'll need to really have a good handle on for this particular extract. So it talks first of all about development indicators. You'll be aware, of course, that there are a number of ways in which we can look at income distribution and development and standards of living and make comparisons from one country to the next. So the most obvious one is obviously to consider GDP per capita. So GDP divided by the population. So you're just taking an average, and that then gives you an average figure for everyone in the country. Now, of course, there are a few problems with that, but the one big problem is, of course, it tells us nothing about the income distribution, because it may well be that there are tens of thousands of people living on the breadline with absolutely nothing, and a handful of people with enormous wealth, and as a consequence of their enormous wealth, it skews the average. So the average may look quite favourable, but we know nothing about the distribution of income. So that's a key problem with looking at GDP per capita. So other measures that are referenced within that paragraph, it talks about poverty. So we know of the terms absolute poverty and relative poverty. What's the difference between the two? Well, absolute poverty means that you are living on the equivalent of less than, and it depends which book you reference for this, but regardless of which book it really is living on next to nothing. You're either living on less than $1 a day or living on less than $1.25 a day. You're in absolute poverty, which means that you cannot even afford the simple essentials of life. Now, that tends to be associated obviously with the less developed countries in the world. But regardless of that, even in a country like Brazil, where we see pockets of poverty obviously in the favela in Brazil, where we have very, very poor individuals who will be living in absolute poverty. You can also be in a country, you can be in relative poverty. So you may know that in this country, in the UK, people who, for example, are in receipt of job seekers allowance, the government would say that that will enable you to provide the essentials of life, but you'll not have any fancy Dan type of lifestyle. And so in that instance, that level that the government sets for job seekers would put you into the realms of relative poverty. You can get by from day to day, but you're not going to have any nice treats from one week to the next. Now another way of looking at that is, and this is a better explanation and definition of it, is to say that your class has been in relative poverty, so relative to everyone else in your country, if you are living on less than 50% of the median income in your country. Now if we take the UK, for example, the median income is £21,400 per annum. So half of that, £10,700. So if you were living on less than £10,700, you would be classed as being relatively poor. But of course one must temper that with how far below this threshold you are, because if you were living on £10,699, then obviously you're not very far below what we would be classing here as the relative poverty line. Whereas if you were living on £4,000 a year, then you are quite significantly below the poverty line. And so certainly in the UK, this is looked at in terms of the gap between your earnings or your household income and half the median income, and that gap is referred to as the income gap. And so that then gives us a little further perspective as to how far you are away from this thing called relative poverty, this household being much further away from this household. So that's absolute and relative poverty. We also then read about the Gini Coefficient. Now, those of you who are well up on your development economics, you will know that this was developed by an Italian economist called Corrado Gini, who passed away in 1965. I bet you didn't realise that 50 years later we would still be talking about the Gini Coefficient. And his work really stems and came from the work which was done previously by Max Lorenz with the Lorenz curve. So I'll very quickly just run through both of those for you here. So the Lorenz curve, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you're aware, is to do with the distribution of income. And we have here the percentage of households, and here we have the percentage of income. And this line, which should be a 45-degree line here, this is the line of perfect equality. This is the line that we're trying to get to, and that would suggest to us that 1% of households would have 1% of the income, 2% of households, 2% of the income, and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of 45-degree line in that respect. Now, most economies do not get anywhere close to that line, and indeed it tends to be skewed out like this. So country A, for example, may have a Lorenz curve, so-called, to show the distribution of income, like so. Now, the whole point of having a tax and benefit system, for example, and that type of government intervention into the market is in anticipation that by taxing the wealthy, as we do in this country, and redistributing in the form of social security payments, we move this towards the line of perfect equality. And so income distribution gets better. So you can see in this example, for example, if we were to say here that this was 50%, well, here we'd be saying that for country A on the red line, we'd be saying 50% of households, let's say, have only 10% of the income. And after intervention, we might be able to say 50% of households then have maybe 20% of the income. And so we are seeing the redistribution, put my teeth back in, the redistribution effects. Now, Gini took this theory one step further and tried to work out something called the Gini coefficient, which is either a percentage or a ratio. So if it's a percentage, it's between 0 and 100, and sometimes it's presented as a decimal between 0 and 1. Now, the general gist of this and the basic premise behind it is as follows. So if we take it on the basis of a decimal between 0 and 1, and using the UK for example, the UK's Gini coefficient most recently is 0.35. Now, the closer that the Gini coefficient gets to 1, the more inequitable the distribution of income and wealth is. So, for example, if the Gini coefficient was 0, that would mean that accounting for household composition and number of dependents in households and so on, it would mean that everyone was earning the same wage. Perfectly equal, of course. So that would be equality. Whereas as we move from 0 to 1, then the closer we get to 1, then that's getting further and further away from equality. So Scandinavian countries, for example, their Gini coefficient tends to be between maybe 0.2 and 0.25, 0.26, something like that. And if you Google this on The Economist magazine especially, you'll find lots of articles about this and why that is the case in Scandinavia with regard to their welfare state and so on. But that's the general premise behind the Gini coefficient. And it tries to measure this, and I could show you how to measure and so on and how areas are calculated, but really it's not necessary here, so we'll not get into that. And then finally, it talks about healthcare school attendance. Now, I want at this stage then to refer you to another indicator of human development, which is of course the Human Development Index. Obviously a problem with the online script reader there, Human Development Index. Now, the Human Development Index, as you will know, is made up of three things: GDP per capita, life expectancy, which is really to do with healthcare, and adult literacy, which is obviously to do with the school and education facilities. So this is the Human Development Index, and so what that first paragraph in the pre-release material is suggesting to us is that these elements of healthcare and school attendance and GDP being the largest economy of the GDP, it's suggesting to us that the HDI measure, which includes those three things, is obviously improving. That's what it's suggesting to us. But as we move further through this extract, we'll find that there are counter-arguments against this. So I'm going to leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen. That's paragraph 1, and the next video I'll bring you will be paragraph 2. If you would like some notes on this, and if you would like me to maybe draw this up in a more formal way, can you drop me a line, and we'll see what arrangement we can come to on that. Okay, so thanks very much. Bye for now.